We'd like to share the rationale and recommendations of the Climate Overshoot Commission's recommendations on SRM, as well as clarify our position on the need for a careful balance between a moratorium on deployment and support for scientific research. We want to learn about the current status of debates and research in the United States on SRM and its role in addressing global warming, the risks associated with it, as well as the potential benefits. And we want to continue to provide a public space for open and transparent debate on this controversial topic. Just to introduce the commission briefly, we were formed in 2022 under the auspices of the Paris Peace Forum chair, and our chair was Pascal Lemay. We had 12 commissioners, half from the global north and half from the global south. Our mission was to address and study the range of options available to avoid overshooting the 1.5 degree goal of the 2015 Paris Agreement. We worked throughout 2023, and the report was issued in September of this last year. As part of our report, we adopted what we like to call the CARE agenda, which is a four-part strategy, C-A-R-E. The C stands for the number one priority, which is to cut emissions. The A stands for adaptation, to increase finance and attention to the issues surrounding adaptation, as many people across the world are being devastated by the impacts of global warming right now. The R in the CARE is to talk about carbon removal, to develop and deploy higher quality carbon removal opportunities through both organic removal means and inorganic, both technological and nature-based. But today, what we will be talking about is the final part of the agenda, the E, which stands for explore, where we address issues surrounding solar radiation modification, specifically recommending that countries adopt a moratorium on large-scale radiation modification, but that research continue under careful oversight and transparency, and that governance considerations and dialogues be developed. We approach the issue of SRM with great caution. We did not deliberate on recommendations concerning its use, but focus specifically on issues of research and governance around possible future consideration of deployment. We were particularly mindful to avoid any suggestions that SRM could offer an alternative to other forms of climate action, and we opposed premature deployment. The first three parts of the CARE agenda are prioritized to how action can take place now. We need to reduce emissions aggressively now, to adopt adaptation strategies now, and to explore and accelerate efforts concerning carbon dioxide removal now. But when we turn to SRM specifically, our recommendations were, as I mentioned earlier, that countries should adopt a moratorium on the deployment and large-scale experiments, that the moratorium should apply to any intervention with risk of significant transboundary harm, regardless of where it occurs, who carries it out, who is responsible for it, and for what purpose. Governance of SRM research should be expanded, and only legitimate non-commercial researchers should be permitted to conduct outdoor experiments, and SRM research should not be led by for-profit firms or those with an interest in fossil fuels continuation. In addition, international coordination of SRM research based on shared priorities shaped by policymakers with equitable North-South representation should be significantly strengthened. So today, to discuss the issues around SRM, we have four expert panelists who have joined us in this discussion. And let me introduce them very briefly, and they can talk a little bit about their work when we get into the questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Lloyd Whitman, who's the Senior Director of the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Whitman has had a long career in government on science policy and has a deep perspective on this issue. Second, I'd like to introduce Shuchi Talati, who is the Executive Director of the recently formed Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, known as DSG. and she's had a career in government serving as the Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Fuel and Carbon Management at the United States Department of Energy. Now I'd like to introduce Edward Parsons, known as Ted, who is a senior advisor to the commission and is the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law at UCLA. He teaches international environmental law and policy with a particular focus on the social impacts and governance of disruptive technologies such as AI and solar radiation modification. And finally, Yashasvi Raj, a PhD student at the Cambridge University and a member of the Youth to the Table of the We Are the Family Foundation. And he his current research focuses on refreezing the Arctic through the deployment of marine cloud brightening. So the four of our panelists have a lot of perspective and expertise to provide on this issue. So let me turn now to the questions, and I'm going to direct the first question to Lloyd Whitman. And Lloyd, please, as we go into this, introduce a little bit of how your work is relevant to this topic. You've been involved in science research in the government and in the policy arena for some time, and you've seen how this issue has evolved, the nature of this conversation about solar radiation and modification has been developing both globally and in the United States. Can you give us a brief overview of where we stand now here in the United States in this issue? What's the state of research and what's the state of debate, and where is that debate and discussion taking place? Just give us a context, if you would. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Frances. And I just want to say I'm really grateful to the Overshoot Commission for inviting me and organizing this discussion, and most importantly, driving this very thoughtful deliberation and discussion of this important topic, seeking to deliberately change the albedo of the Earth system, reflecting solar radiation back into space to cool the planet. So I'm not a longtime expert on this topic, as anyone can quickly tell by looking at my, for instance, a LinkedIn page. I have a really deep interest in it and experience actually with a broad range of emerging tech, including areas like nanotechnology, which decades ago was surrounded by many similar ethical, legal, and societal concerns and unknowns. And so I'm humbled to participate in this esteemed panel. I just want to say a few words. The Atlantic Council, if you're not familiar with it, it's a Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan nonprofit working to shape global challenges like this. And our Geotech Center is looking at specifically on how emerging technologies play into this space, including ones like this. So I also just want to add that I don't actually speak for the U.S. government or the Atlantic Council, but here to express my personal views and share, and I'm happy to share my current understanding of U.S. policy and planning. Right? So the obviously the big the main messaging on this topic from the U.S. Was the recent report from the Office of Science and Technology Policy on this topic. Though I will just, this is a global conversation. So, in the US, these kinds of things have a lot of different players. So there's, the White House, which coordinates things across the agencies. There's the federal agencies, which, for example, will fund the research or the technology development, or places like state, which will focus on the diplomacy. And of course, the US Congress will actually both authorize things to occur and appropriate funds, and in some cases, direct things to occur. So back in 2020, Congress actually included specific language directing NOAA and also STP to look at this issue. And in fact, there's money in that issue. So it's interesting to look from an R&D perspective. There's two components to this. One is this very specific research or discussion about SRM, and then of course the larger climate issue, right? The federal R&D budget for climate in the U.S. is about $4 billion over 10 agencies, and of course much of that is in areas like modeling, which would include the effect, how aerosols interact and things that's directly relevant to this topic, if not specifically aimed at it. Though there is it looks like about I'm going to say about 10 million. Let's see, it's about maybe about $20 million a year specifically on this topic right now. So NOAA has a program in collaboration with NASA on that's pretty specifically about SRM within mostly the energy, the overall radiation budget research. That's about $9 million a year. And if you look at look at NSF, they're spending probably another million or a couple million, but partly now some specific research in this area, and also looking at starting to have people look at governance. So there is some movement there. Again, the specific thing is rather small, but it's part of a very, very large pie that, of course, is fairly relevant. I think from the specific part of the governance, you know, I think the administration will, is, as we all know, very, very, very strongly focused on reducing emissions, increasing resilience, looking at environmental justice and energy security. And, they'll talk about spending $1 trillion across all those different areas. I think that from the framework that they published at OSDP really is viewed as the sort of statement of policy, right? They're focused on all these issues, but they want to make sure everyone's on the same page as they start doing research, which they are starting to fund research in this area. So it's a somewhat long rambling answer to say that there's movement, right? So the agencies are talking about it, they're starting to fund some research, but it's also viewed in the much larger priority of reducing emissions and also just generally improving climate science.
So can I just ask one quick follow-up, Lloyd? It sounds like very early days. I mean, that it's beginning to focus on it compared to everything else. It's sort of a very nascent, rather small part.
Yeah, it really, with the OSDP report, which laid out basically, principles of transparency, making agencies do it. But, it's fair to say it sort of SRM is not a huge priority, but,
right.
I like to say at least they're talking about it now. They very, the OSDP, uses a similar framework as the Overshoot Commission report in terms of a sort of a risk versus risk framing, right? But and the OSDP report actually is a pretty comprehensive, if not super long, but really does touch on all of the issues across from science to the societal issues. Where that goes, I think right now, let me just comment from the big picture, and I want to give people a chance to talk. Just you can see the difficulty at COP28 of even starting to talk about carbon capture and removal, as opposed to just strictly limiting emissions. So I think we're a ways from going, from having a really active and upfront dialogue on this issue. But I think I think there's progress even in terms of getting the carbon part into COP.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So, Ted, I'm going to turn to you now. You were an advisor to the commission, and in that, you spoke to us about why you thought it was important to proceed with focusing on SRM and where you thought there was potential. I'd like you to talk about that, but also talk about what you think the risks associated with it are, and how best to advance a research agenda that both looks at both parts of the risk equation.
Thank you, Frances. Thanks for the invitation today, and thank you for your leadership and contribution on the commission. So I'm a professor at the UCLA Law School, and I'm also the faculty director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, where we do a bunch of legal and policy and regulatory work across all elements of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, CDR, at the state, national, and international level. We also have a project here on the governance of solar geoengineering, or SRM, that I've led for about 7 years. I guess it's important to start the answer by saying SRM cannot fully reduce the effects of greenhouse gas-driven climate change. That is an intrinsic limitation that applies to any method that's been investigated. So the best that could possibly be achieved, under conditions severe enough to warrant it, would be that SRM could provide a stopgap that buys time to make the big change, the transformative changes necessary to reduce emissions to zero. But even if you're using SRM in the interim, you still have to do that. It is only an interim band-aid, a stopgap solution. The state of knowledge is kind of surprising. It's a sort of one-hand, other-hand story. It's solid enough to indicate that SRM warrants a much more serious look with more extensive research. And that's based on sort of diffuse, broad basis for confidence that it could work. It could cool the climate quite uniformly and with relatively small environmental impacts. It's a long, long way from enough knowledge to warrant taking these results as certain and running ahead to do full-scale deployment. But we actually know quite a lot about the processes involved, and not just from the small amount of research that's been done explicitly on SRM. The main method, putting sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere, replicates natural aerosols, periodic events that inject more from volcanoes, and also is very similar to some of the air pollution that we emit down low. So there's a lot of knowledge about the effects of that from observation of other atmospheric processes. For example, that's mainly what the NOAA research program that Lloyd referred to is doing. They're doing baseline flights in the stratosphere to measure and characterize the aerosols that are there already. For the additional research, the model studies that have been done looking at what SRM would do placed on top of some projected climate change scenario, there's been about 100 studies done, and the results are sort of shockingly strongly favorable, even in many cases where the researchers went into the study trying to find a way to break it and show that it couldn't possibly work. The broad results of those model studies, which require making assumptions about how SRM is used, are that it looks like it can reduce greenhouse gas-driven climate change almost everywhere in the world. Like the model studies show maybe 1 to 2% of the surface area of the world where an SRM intervention actually takes the climate the wrong way. It either makes it, too hot or even hotter or even wetter. But it's a long way from confidence to support near-term action. And the one thing that hasn't been done, and on which the Commission made, I think, a real advance, is nobody's actually done a field study, even at the tiniest scale, to go out and look at whether stuff would work in the way that it's assumed to work in the models. There have been a couple of proposals to do studies, from one place, basically putting a few kilograms of material in the stratosphere to see what happens, that have been slowed and challenged by controversy, mainly related to the societal and governance implications. And I guess I just want to close by saying there's a sort of a contrast here. The scientific research, we know a lot more than we would think because it connects to so many areas that are well known, and the results are shockingly favorable. But the role of SRM could only be favorable for human welfare and the environment, depending upon its being used and controlled properly. And most of the high stakes issues and the big concerns and controversies are actually not about what do aerosols do in the stratosphere. They're about who would control this, how would they use it, for what ends, would it be competent, would it be just, would it be non-corrupt, would countries fight over it? That's a little outside what you asked me to do, but I really do have to say those are the big problems.
Yeah, thanks very much. Those are the problems that we're here to think about today. So, Shuchi, turning to you, one of the things the Commission discussed was, what's the state of multilateral governance? Can it deal with this issue now? We're in a challenging geopolitical time. One of the things that we heard again was that there wasn't equity in either knowledge, research funds, conversations about solar radiation management, that there was a lot of inequity in the issue that needed to be addressed over time. And you've started this new organization, which, by the way, please describe. And also, if you would give us your own thoughts on how do we make issues of equity, ensure that developing economies, countries all over the world, as these issues get into more and more of a global discussion, how they have an equal voice, central position in those conversations. Could you just share with us your thoughts on those issues, if you would?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. So this new organization that I formed called the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering was launched last April and is really thinking about this nexus of justice and governance dimensions of SRM. How do we really think about the frameworks that will be necessary to have legitimate and inclusive discussions on this emerging topic? And what are the pathways to get there? And so this is absolutely not advocacy around SRM, but really thinking about how we have better and more equitable conversations. And, and I think at the real core of that is capacity. How do we actually build capacity for people to engage? And this doesn't just mean capacity in research and science, which is essential, of course, essential, but also capacity in governance. How do we help policy institutions, environmental organizations, human rights organizations, democracy organizations engage in conversations about something that will be globally impactful? And really, where do those conversations need to happen? And so this organization is really trying to think about where we can build that capacity, who we can engage with, and how we can enable pathways for them to participate in where these discussions are happening. And you talked about multilateral institutions, which I think are very essential to kind of the overarching governance of SRM. And one of the challenges is that, over the last few years, there has been an unwillingness to engage on this topic. I think very thankfully, over the last couple of years, we've started to see a shift, and major UN institutions start engaging in this topic in early ways. We saw a major UN EP report come out last year called One Atmosphere, calling for more research and more inclusive deliberation. We saw UNESCO write an ethical framework on climate intervention that came out late last year. And I think these are really promising steps forward. What we haven't seen is the UNFCCC being willing to engage on this topic, which I think will be an essential platform for SRM discussions to happen. But I think, there are several steps before I think we can have equitable conversations at that level, which is capacity at national levels around the world, especially in the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. And I hope, DSG, alongside other organizations that are starting to engage in this space, start to kind of really think about what we can do to make sure that capacity exists, and how we can actually make sure that we are thinking about inclusion really at the core of what that means. I think it's a word that we say quite a lot in the climate space, but really thinking about the kind of essential pathways to have a debate that actually considers the equitable participation of so many is really, really challenging. This is not something that we've been successful at in climate overall. And so we really need to think about what new frameworks we need to build to make that consideration better. And I think we have opportunities to do that.
Great, thanks so much. That's really helpful. So now, Yashish, I'd like to turn to you. You're actually doing research in this field on marine cloud brightening, which I hope you'll share with us a little bit. And I'm sure as part of that, you're both part of a youth group that's representing how youth are thinking of this issue, and you're doing research on the issue. So how best do we open a discussion or conduct a discussion on SRM? Try to understand new technologies, and also be sure that we're hearing all the voices across generations on this. How do you think about this issue?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion, and thank you to the Overshoot Commission. So as a brief introduction, my name is Yashas. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, working in the Center for Climate Repair. And my research is specifically around marine cloud brightening, as you mentioned, which is a technique not often considered in the SRM scope. Usually SRM mainly is talking about stratospheric aerosol injection. But marine cloud brightening, or MCB, is a way to intervene and artificially enhance and increase the albedo of marine clouds. And what that does is it makes a brighter cloud to ideally reflect sunlight back into space and cause a local cooling effect. So that's a brief description of my work, and there's 3 other students working on marine cloud brightening techniques. I'm working on one specific type of experimental technique. The biggest challenge when it comes to marine cloud brightening is actually generating, the technical challenge is generating the suitable size droplets for this technique. They have to be sub-micron droplets of seawater at trillions of droplets a second. So there's a huge technical challenge, which is what researchers are trying to overcome. And but to speak on your point about the different perspectives of youth in the area, I had the privilege of attending the most recent COP28 in Dubai as a We Are Family Foundation youth delegate. We Are Family Foundation is a foundation co-founded by Nile Rodgers, the musician, to bring youth to the table and have youth perspectives taken into consideration in these global convenings. And when I was at COP, I got to speak to a lot of different youth that are hands-on in the climate space, whether it's climate justice, conservation. It's a wide variety and diversity of perspectives and passions, with all of them being climate minded. And when I was having these conversations, I ran into these two main groups. I realized that it was a very polarizing debate, where there's one aspect which is a group of young people who are genuinely just afraid of the risk that you mentioned earlier, that this would just be an excuse for greenhouse gas emitting oil companies to say that we'll continue emitting and we have this backup. And I feel like that fear is rightfully so, because as young people growing up in the world, we've lost a lot of faith that large companies and governments would work on the general populace's best interests, or the young people's best interests. And we've seen this for the past 30 years. We've known that greenhouse gas emissions needed to be reduced and essentially stopped. Yet this was the first year that greenhouse gas, or transitioning away from fossil fuels was mentioned in a single COP. So there's this disenchantment when it comes to youth and demonstrable climate action. So that's one side. And when I mentioned my research and my field, I remember a specific moment where I was met with this kind of bristling effect of one of the young people, and they thought I was one of the bad guys, and that was one of the main reasons I actually came to COP, was to humanize the research of SRM, specifically marine cloud brightening, and put a face to the name. I'm not sponsored by large oil companies. I'm not a deep state agent. I'm simply someone who's trying to research something that could be a part of the solution. As Ted mentioned, this is not the one solution that will fix everything. And this goes back to the Center for Climate Repair. There are three main tenets that you can see on our website. The first one is reduce. We must reduce these carbon emissions. And the second one is removal of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane. And the third, which is I'm working on, which is refreeze, working on refreezing, critical areas such as the Arctic. And finally, I do want to mention the other side of the debate, which is there's a lot of young people who are very passionate about SRM, and specifically SRM in the Arctic. There's a great group called Operatio Arctic, which is a group of young people in Northern European countries that are looking at preserving the Arctic, and they were on the ground in COP28, and they were actually representing these specific dialogues. But also, going to Shuchi's point, it's really important that all these perspectives are considered. There was a lot of concern from young people in the global south, specifically in areas that are now almost uninhabitable due to the extreme heat, that we're worried that global north countries would impose SRM technology on it without their input, and without this just implementation. So it's really important that all these perspectives are considered. But I do believe that SRM definitely should be researched, and actually understanding this technologies could be a very crucial part of the overall climate action.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Ted, I'd like to turn back to you, and maybe Lloyd, you have a comment on this too. So one of the recommendations of the Commission in this arena, the first is for countries to call for a moratorium on deployment. We discussed whether there should be like a, some kind of global moratorium, but through the UN process, et cetera, that would be very time consuming. We would be well beyond overshoot by the time we got that done. So we talked about individual countries. So, what I'm very interested in is some country has to take the lead. Is there a possibility that the United States would be that country, that there would be an opportunity to get the United States to lead in this and call for a moratorium while research is being done and more knowledge is developed, or if not here, do you see that opportunity any other place? And Shuchi and Yashish, if you have comments on that, please include it as well, because obviously some momentum has to start somewhere. And do you see that that's an avenue that could develop some momentum?
Thank you. And actually, in answering that, I first want to acknowledge that I was so impressed by the way the Commission struggled with this issue. It was obviously very challenging, and there were some kind of painful realities to confront. I mean, the Commission's job was to take really seriously the prospect that we might exceed the Paris targets and ask about what that means for responses. The debate on SRM has been very fraught and difficult because there have been sort of cogently, passionately argued views that basically say this is a path you don't want to start down at all. But these views have been formed without a lot of information about the precise severity of climate risks that are coming soon, or about the effects and side effects of SRM. So the Commission, there's a sense in which the Commission's job was to demonstrate how to talk responsibly about SRM. And I think framing it in that way, they did a really impressive job with the carefully balanced recommendation, a moratorium on the big stuff that is the real source of the most intense alarm, and at the same time, encouragement of research, international consultation, assessment, governance, development. In terms of who could take the lead in promoting that initiative, I don't know that I would single out the United States in particular. I mean, I think that the best way that there could be concrete progress at government level toward this would be if there were informal consultations among half a dozen governments, including some north and some south, to kind of agree to move together to endorse the moratorium coupled with the expanded research, governance, and consultation. The two really have to go together. The big risk that I see in this recommendation is that the concept of the moratorium will be over-interpreted or over-generalized. There have been already comments circulating on the Commission's report saying, yeah, a moratorium is great, but it has to cover small-scale experiments too. But no, those are exactly the research that is needed to know whether this stuff could work and what risks it would carry. So that has to go on. What has to not go on in the near term is moving towards something big with transnational impacts and all the attendant geopolitical disruptions, threats of inadequate governance, threats of injustice and deployment. Big stuff. So the threshold the Commission articulated, a risk of significant transboundary harm, is the right and sensible threshold for a moratorium, because it's the stuff beyond that that is the source of the really serious concerns and risks. And we need to know more. I mean, Mike McCracken in the comments has scolded me for apparently implying that I said we need to have certainty before we can proceed. And of course, we don't. But the model studies that we have alone are not sufficient to inform any decision about how or whether this can be used. And the research needs to be expanded, including small field experiments, to get that knowledge. Last point on this, we don't know how bad things are going to get how fast. And it's entirely plausible that there would be, even quite soon, countries or regions experiencing severe climate impacts that would press aggressively to proceed with developing and implementing SRM. The Commission can't stop that. No one government can stop that. The only way to stop the worst consequences of that is to go better and do better and harder on every aspect of climate response and start talking now about geopolitical and governance risks, so that if and when there's serious pressure to do something bigger, this would be the end of a moratorium. If and when that happens, there's a basis for trust and collaboration internationally. So US leadership, yes, but not in the sense of US going out alone in front carrying the flag and expecting everybody else to follow. Thank you.
Can
Thanks,
I
Ted.
something to that too?
Yeah, Shuchi, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would just add, I totally agree with Ted, and I also think it's also important to consider some of the, the historical climate politics of the US and also the volatility of our political system in making these moves, right? We haven't historically been the leader in climate policy globally, and especially considering a potential administration that pulled out of the Paris Agreement, trying to take strides in SRM policy could be really dangerous from a global perspective of countries seeing, a country that hasn't made the best decisions for a global public good, making global decisions about SRM. And so I would just caution us to think about, where we would want to see the US take a leadership role and where the US should support others in kind of building their capacity to make these decisions.
Yeah.
Great. Lloyd, do you have a comment?
Yeah. First, I just want to say, I think I misread my notes earlier. I said two different things. I don't actually think, I think my best estimate is about $10 million of what R&D is. I think I said 20 at one point because I doubled the number. So yeah, I think, to be really direct is, would the US government lead on a moratorium? And I'd say, I think it's really, premature that they wouldn't need to even have that conversation according, along the lines of what Ted said, right? Is, before you can even have a conversation about moratorium, you have to have a conversation about the topic, right? And there's the science issues, there's the government issues, and there's the geopolitics, and they're all, so that's why this, why I'm here and why I think the commission report is so important is to get people talking about the issues, what the science is, what the science tells it can do, what the science tells us that's unlikely to do, and have these conversations that drive transparency, right? Because you have to have these kind of conversations before you can even get to say anyone talking about a moratorium, because you also have to define, as was just indicated, what do you mean by moratorium? What exactly is that? What is the scale? Are we even close to having the technology to do something at scale that anyone could afford? So there's so many different sort of elements to this that sort of go up to that. And so we need to just be having those conversations before we can have that one.
Very helpful. So I'd like to shift. We've talked a lot about what the research around SRM is. That's the specific scientific research. But one of the things that the commission heard a lot about was, first of all, scientific research is pretty much directed in the global north. It's not available globally, and that research budget needs to be expanded. So countries all over the world have their own expertise on it and can develop that. But we also heard that there was very little on the socioeconomic side, on the human aspects of the issues surrounding SRM. And Shuchi, maybe you would comment on that. I mean, what we heard was the research agenda not only needs to be expanded geographically, but it needs to be expanded across disciplines. So it's not just in the physical technical sciences, but incorporates many other aspects of it. And I think it would be illuminating to talk a little bit about that as well. And Yashish, you might have commentary on that too. You're probably considering it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are countless social dimensions related to SRM research and potential deployment. And mitigating those impacts really means that we have to actually understand what those look like from the perspective of those who might experience them and the questions that they have that we're not even considering. I think building social science research enterprises alongside physical science research enterprises in a lot of these countries is so important to be able to consider how different human systems will function under different scenarios. I think the way we think about human and ecological systems in the United States looks quite different than a lot of the way these knowledge systems function in a lot of different communities. And so taking that into consideration really means actually supporting that different type of work and making sure that these other types of knowledge are being integrated into the type of research that we're supporting.
Okay, Yashasvi, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Shuchi. It's this multifaceted, approach that we need to take when considering these types of global impacting technologies. And while I am mainly focused on the technical aspects of one of these technologies, I know that there's a lot of research. I think specifically the Center for Climate Repair actually ran a study on the how people feel about SRM, but also about the social impact of SRM. That was one of the research projects previously. But it's honestly just going to be a really big discussion. The only thing is, as Ted mentioned, this is going to be a temporary solution. And as the temporary solution on a fixed timeline, it's going to be interesting to see when does the discussions reach implementation, if it does ever, and if that's in time to make enough change for buying time for stopping emissions.
Yeah, well, Yashasvi, could you comment on the timeline and Ted as well? I mean, one of the things, the reason that the commission adopted the CARE agenda was what can be done now, and looking at the horizon, there was research that needed to be done, broadened. There were, if there are field experiments to go forward to understand those, that, my understanding was this was several decades out, and I think for people listening to this panel, understanding sort of what time frame are we considering actually understanding this issue so that you could evaluate whether it was a reasonable solution or not. And I guess part of that is something like, if you're targeting the Arctic, is that the same time frame as if you were doing something on a more global scale? Perhaps you could address that,
Yeah.
Yashasvi, and then others comment as well, because understanding we're up against 1.5 and overshooting it, but the availability of this is not in the immediate term either. So ensuring that people understand that context would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The time frame for the Arctic and the general world is vastly different. With the Arctic warming at 4 times the rate of the global average, it's a critically impacted environment and area, and specifically when it comes to timeline, it's been predicted that the Arctic would experience its first ice-free summer by 2030, so by the end of this decade. So it's a very, very tight timeline for exploring SRM technologies and non-SRM technologies. For example, one of the researchers at the Center for Climate Repair is actually in the Arctic right now working on ice thickening to preserve existing ice. But the timeline for the Arctic, as I mentioned, is exceptionally fast. But the conversation for broader solar radiation management on the large scale is slightly longer than that. But there's also this in the United States, going back to Shuchi's point about climate policy. I think it also should be mentioned I don't want to mention this certain startup, but there are a lot of people who are looking into SRM for profit, which is extremely bad for so many reasons. I read recently some Silicon Valley guy read Termination Shock, and which is a sci fiction book on solar radiation that mentions solar radiation management, and decided to go on and do their own unsanctioned SAI experiment in the real world, and that's extremely problematic. So I can understand why a global moratorium for large scale experiments is called, but there's also the other aspect of me being an SRM researcher, which is there's a there's a SciComm issue here where there's not actually an understanding of what SRM entails, going to Lloyd's point, which is, of course, the implications and the discussions for implementing it is important, but also even, I think just before that is everyone should understand vaguely what does SRM entail, what is it, what the limitations are, and etc.
So if I can come in on the timeline issue, I mean, I think the only fair answer to your question, Francis, is that we kind of have no idea, and we're talking about 3 different timelines. We're talking about the timeline for how fast things get how bad on climate impacts, which is going to have a lot to do with motivating interest and attention to these interventions. Then we have the timeline for how long would it take to build up understanding and capability and collaboration responsibly. And there's this sort of popular wisdom around the field that, oh, to get to a program that would be okay takes something like 10 years. But then when you dig in closer and pose, hypothetical questions of this form, suppose things really go south badly very quickly and there is a highly motivated, technically capable, government that wants to proceed. I don't think we can say with confidence that, they couldn't do anything for 10 years. A highly motivated government based upon well-established foundational scientific knowledge and a bunch of knowledge gaps about how you actually do it with what effects could probably move toward deployment in a few years of intensive effort. I think the threat of profit-motivated movements towards deployment is widely exaggerated because there's just not that much money to be made in this. I heard recently that a couple of SRM researchers, had a conversation with executives at Boeing asking, are you paying attention to this? And are you thinking you might make new airplanes, that would do this? And the answer was, this is far too remote and risky and too small a market. We would never invest in something like this. So it's hard to guess whether the failure mode might be more on the side of reckless people run ahead and do it too fast and there's lots of trouble, or everybody's so careful that climate impacts get really, really grave and there's not a kind of a knowledge and capability developed. The one aspect of this I'd point out as well, which is important, is things are starting to move very fast. So Janos Pastor in the comments has pointed out that there's a resolution that's been submitted to go to the UN Environment Assembly next month. We might also note that the World Climate Research Program adopted a couple of months ago a new lighthouse project on. So international institutions are moving. Private philanthropists are increasing their support for research, and it is likely that there will be a great deal more attention, controversy, and research resources invested soon. So moving quickly with some kind of care and deliberation about getting better and more complete research, talking about governance, while also trying to put in place something like the moratorium to address the most severe concerns, seems that it's quite an urgent priority.
Great, thanks. So before we turn to the questions, which Ted's been reading all along the way, so that's good. What is centered in a lot of these conversations, I think every conversation around SRM, are the ethical issues that it raises. Who decides? What authority do they have to decide? How much knowledge is there? I mean, right now, a lot of the conversation is centered in the scientific world, beginning to be in the policy world, just less in the public. This is Shuchi's obviously working on that aspect, but starting with Lloyd, would you just address how do we ensure that the ethical questions that are very much at the center of this stay there and are part of the conversation? That the conversation is not purely technical, but it addresses these issues of equity, inclusion, who gets to decide on how you alter the planet, even though those alterations have already occurred without that conversation having taken place, by the way. But if you would start that conversation, would be helpful.
Yeah, so something I say a lot about a lot of emerging technology, including things like AI, there's a tendency from the science and the technical community to sort of develop things for people, and really it should be developed with them, right? So engaging, and I think when one of the other panelists also made a comment about that, right? That this about engaging with the communities throughout, whether it's the people like the United States engaging with the global South and other places who are suffering the most and responsible the least. I also like to say, I think there's, again, there's conversations that happen in three places. So there's ethical conversations around the science, which has to do with, how do we invest? Who do we talk to? What are the guidelines, the frameworks, for example, in the OCV report? And then there's ethics around, talking about ultimate deployment and what that might look like and who does it. And that goes to, for example, Yana's questions about using forum like the UNEA or UNFFC and, FCCC and things like that. CFFF, me. So using those kind of forums, and then, there's some of the just whole ethics about who's in the conversation. So I'm not sure I'm being super articulate about this other than to say those conversations have to happen with a lot of different people in each of those communities because they're actually quite distinct. So especially in the science S&T community where I come from, where people tend to view those as someone else's issue. So, for example, I'm happy to see, the National Science Foundation actually is starting to look in their social and behavioral economics division on some of these kinds of to fund research and workshops and things on that topic. Even if it's small, it's a good place to start. So I think, again, it comes back to being willing to have the conversations and making sure that all of those different communities are all building in those sort of ethical considerations and doing outreach to different communities in those conversations.
Great. Shuchi, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I agree with Lloyd. And I think one thing I would add is just an emphasis on actually just having conversations about this. I think there's a lot of assumptions in this community about what the Global South wants. I think, there's, whether it's from the perspective of people against SRM saying the Global South doesn't want this, or people pro saying the Global South will need this, we don't have any of those answers. And I would suggest actually engaging with this massively heterogeneous set of countries and communities, even within those countries, to maybe engage with them to ask those types of questions, because we don't know. And making any sorts of assumptions on what people want, I think, is always going to blow up in your face. And so we actually need to engage with these questions with the people it will impact the most, and make sure that we're centering these really challenging issues in the way this issue is brought to them, right? I think we don't want to paint any bias around what this technology could or could not bring, and to make sure that the very real issues that we're grappling with are ones that we are making very clear around this topic, because that's really the only way you can actually build good governance systems around something so challenging.
Right. That's very helpful. One of the questions in the chat, and I don't of the four of you who can address it, but one of the questions was, are there field experiments taking place in other parts of the world? For example, China, India. I don't believe there are, but if one of you has knowledge on that, can you share it?
No recent ones that have been published.
Well,
Okay.
I can say that there is ongoing research for marine cloud brightening above the Great Barrier Reef. That's one of our collaborators at Southern Cross University who are working on ways to reflect incoming solar radiation above the Great Barrier Reef to slow down the coral bleaching of the increased temperatures in the water. So that is I mean, relatively small scale, but it is an ongoing field test. And one of our postdocs are actually down in Queensland on a boat trying to figure out how this is working. And the Australian government is actually extremely supportive of any techniques possible to preserve the Great Barrier Reef.
Great, that's very helpful. Another question in the chat and sort of came up, Shuchi, you addressed it, I think, a little bit, is isn't there an important role for the UN here, whether it's UNEP or UNFCCC? The Commission discussed the UN and in many guises, and of course, over the course of the year, and we didn't come to a conclusion on whether the UN, some part of the UN, was the right place to address this. But that is a question in the chat, and perhaps you, Shuchi, could address whether you think the UN has the capacity to do that. I think the Commission, even though we didn't conclude it, Ted, if I'm right, in our recommendations, we sort of thought, you've got to look at a new entity to sort of take on this global challenge. It's more akin to sort of a nuclear threat or, a chemical threat. It's quite specific, and perhaps you would need, but we didn't actually make a recommendation in that avenue. So we didn't embrace the UN, but we didn't embrace anything else either. So maybe you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, the language the Commission settled on in its final report was a little ambiguous. It
Yes.
gestured towards several existing activities underway now in UN bodies.
Mhm.
The UNEP interest in an assessment, recent consultations in UNESCO, the World Climate Research Program, but it didn't bet on one horse. It didn't say, this is the way to take this forward, nor did it come to a strong view on the more foundational question, which is, are there any existing institutions or treaties that could be stretched or made to fit to be suitable for the governance of this issue, or does it take something new? And if so, what does that look like? That is a big, very challenging set of questions that the Commission, I think, appropriately didn't comment on at this stage, because the really important thing at this stage is getting research and governance consultations going. And the aim of the moratorium is to assuage concerns about a rapid rush to big stuff and thereby enable the small knowledge enhancing and consultation enhancing things that do need to happen.
Any other comments on that? I think that's very helpful. That is clearly what we concluded was these and we didn't come to a conclusion of what the governance structure. We came to a conclusion, as we did in many of the arenas, that these things have to happen and the appropriate bodies have to start the conversations around governance, around expanded research, around ethical questions, et cetera. So we didn't conclude with them. Shuchi?
One other thing I would add, I agree with Ted, and I think over the last couple of years, as we've seen more UN bodies being willing to engage in this conversation, I think what's really going to be helpful is when these bodies actually start talking to each other, to actually really think about the ways in which they interact and what their mandates are and how they kind of need to really think about SRM in different ways. I do feel like, from my perspective, I'm not sure if the bodies we have are capable of thinking about SRM in the ways that are needed, given that the two examples that you gave, Frances, were both from a weapons-oriented perspective, and SRM is a potential technology meant to aid in preventing human suffering. And the context of how we think about that should probably be a little bit different, though it could be extremely harmful, right? And so we need to really think about the types of institutions that can grapple with that. And I'm still not sure, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I think that was our conclusion. We weren't sure either, but it's certainly, if Ted has, I think, spoken powerfully to how important figuring out governance is, and beginning those conversations to have some kind of a governance structure is very, very important. So we have 2 minutes left, and I'd like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to just conclude the conversation and identify, perhaps in your closing thoughts, what you think the most important issue to address going forward is, and how to proceed. So, Shuchi, why don't I start with you, and looking at my screen going around.
Sure. I think my priorities around SRM are clear, just given that my work focuses on building capacity. And so building capacity for both research and in governance, I think, are very central to making sure SRM can move forward in an effective and just way.
Great. Yashasvi, what is your closing thought on this? And particularly focusing on the youth element, which is part of what you're representing, as well as the technology development.
Exactly. So aside from my research, actually expanding on the technical aspects of SRM, I think a really important aspect of this discussion is increasing climate literacy and just general understanding of SRM, because I think that's the main hurdle before we can talk about these discussions. Everyone should actually have an unbiased and kind of complete picture of what SRM entails. And given that getting that complete picture requires expanding research, so it's research must be expanded and then used to inform policy and general discussions. But also, I think moving forward, getting these kind of panels and more open to the general public is a great start to this discussion.
Great, thank you. Lloyd, over to you.
So to use a perhaps, I think, an apt analogy, I'd say the most important thing is sunlight. Just, transparency, right? I mean,
Okay.
the best, for an emerging technology when there isn't strong governance yet in place and people are still trying to figure it out, the most important thing is to make sure everyone can see what everybody else is doing and talking about, right?
Very cool.
And that's relatively, I think, a somewhat easier lift than, for example, getting to a moratorium, is making sure in conversations, in multinational fora, that people agree just to be really transparent about what they're funding, what they're doing, and what they're talking about.
Very helpful. Ted, last word. Briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, two things. One, we have to take a robust and adaptive approach. There will be shocking, surprising, disruptive things happen in this space of all kinds. And the notion that it's possible to map out a kind of orderly step-by-step rational progression toward a decision, it's like things will get messed up and there's a need for advancing knowledge early. Second, the advancing research program can't just be model-based, as most of the research so far has done. There is a really acute need for reality testing by going out into the real world and even looking at hardware and stuff like that. Things might not work. We might be assuming that things work when they turn out not to. And that's all. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank all four of you. This conversation has been really illuminating, very helpful. I'm sure there'll be more conversations around this. This is a critical issue as the planet continues to warm with ever acceleration, unfortunately. So thank you all. And this will be available on YouTube, and those who want to watch it, please do so. Thank you to the Climate Commission, Overshoot Commission, for hosting the seminar.
And thanks to you and my co-panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Great to be here.